I'd like to just comment a bit on our name and the tiger. The tiger is actually Beryl Cook's tiger in Kew Garden. And the reason we use the tiger as a emblem of our foundation was that a natural killer cell actually looks like a microscopic piece of snot. It's just a little piece of mucus if you look at it under a microscope, and we thought this natural killer was a much better idea to represent natural killer cells. The reason we used the term Nightingale was when Florence Nightingale, who was a health administrator, not a nurse, came back from the Crimea. She was in her late 30s. The coach left her off at the entrance of her father's house, which had a long tree-lined laneway of almost 500,000 feet long. She had to crawl from the carriage, because no one met her, to the house. It took her almost 2 hours to crawl that distance. And over the next 22, 23, 24 years, until she was about 60, she had to be carried around, and she was actually carried around by soldiers who had returned from the Crimea. And in effect, she was bedridden. She was like a house-ridden ME patient is today. One of the groups of ME patients that have never been seriously investigated by me or by anyone else that I know of, certainly not in any number. From her bed, she not only reorganized the way hospitals are constructed in the United Kingdom, the entire health system in the United Kingdom, the military organization, the sewer system of Calcutta, the German military health system, which enabled them to win the war against France in the 1880s. But she did this from her bed. And in a way, the Ellen Pirots of the world, with their assistants, such as Eva Stormaken, are really the Florence Nightingales of today's ME world. And I would like just to once again applaud Ellen Pirot for her incredible work. She's basically started this from her bed, and she's shown what ME people can do. And I really want to thank her. I want to show you a study we did in 1990, 1988 period. And this was the age at the bottom from 1 year on until 18, I believe it is there. And where you see at puberty, the number of men who fell ill, and this is a bit different from Dan's chart, but this is what we found in our group, how at puberty the number of women take off in terms of ME symptomology. And there again is that graph a little bit later going on from 18. And so you have to start to think that there's a endocrinological hormonal relationship that hasn't been discussed yet. What drew me into the sphere that not only physical things injure patients, but insurance industry, was that in the period 1984 to 1988-89, there was an epidemic period that hit Lake Tahoe. We saw it in Montreal. We saw it in Ottawa with clumps and clusters of people falling ill with ME. And what really struck me is between 1984 and 1990, I saw about 20 physicians who had fallen ill during this period with ME. And they broke down into roughly two groups, those with insurance and those without insurance. And the 10 roughly patients who didn't have insurance, and most of these were young physicians. And when you graduate in medicine, you've got a lot of debt, and why take on an insurance policy? Because you're not going to fall chronically ill in the next 2 or 3 years. But it's healthcare workers and teachers who are the individuals that fall most ill with this group of disease in terms of percentages. What I found absolutely shocking at that time is although, and in some instances, they fell ill, these physicians, in the same clusters, the ones without insurance were much more ill. They were severely ill, more so than those who had insurance. Now, the Canadian Medical Association insurance policy is absolutely iron-cast. The insurance companies cannot touch it. If they try to cut out the physicians just rise up and attack in mass, in effect. And so their insurance policies have been very good. But those poor physicians who had no insurance were so ill, it is in that group that we saw the suicides. It was that group that we saw them leaving medicine. And it was in the group of physicians who had an insurance policy that could stay at home and rest and have decent food on the table, did not have stress or anxiety making their illness worse. It is from that group that we saw improvement over the period, sometimes 10, 12 years before some of them got better. So the effect of having good insurance or no insurance was absolutely black and white in my understanding of the disease at that time. Now, I'm going to show you some slides, and this again is simply a slide we showed last year about how we saw the onset of this. Now, I'm going to repeat these slides from last year. We saw, I had a patient from England said, "Could you take me on?" And I tried to say no, because I knew it meant I had to come to the United Kingdom, I had to see his physicians, I had to examine him. And so I said, "I'm sure I will, but it'll be £6,000, hoping he would say no. I received a money order for £6,000. So I felt a bit embarrassed, and I took him on. And this slide I showed you last year, he was sent to the psychiatrist, David Gill, who saw him, and he had classical ME, and he gave him this diagnosis: chronic depressive disorder, obsessional personality traits, probably no physical illness, multiple psychosocial stressors including work, relationship problems, impairment in reality, judgment, and thinking and mood. This was the psychiatrist that the insurance company sent him to. This is classical. When in Canada we have any insurance company sending a patient to see a psychiatrist, we inform the patient, if we can get them first, let us send you to a psychiatrist first that is going to be honest, because these are, as far as I'm concerned, hired guns who just really want the money, the big check from the insurance company to say there's nothing wrong with these people. We do the same thing with the neuropsychologists. They're just as bad. And we send our patients to a neuropsychologist first who knows ME, who can actually give a rational diagnosis. Now, Dr. Gill wanted to put him on amitriptyline. This is a common, inexpensive antidepressant that is given to a lot of ME patients, but it actually causes a form of heart block in ME patients, and in many cases can provoke heart disease in a significant number of ME patients. And this is his advice that I copied down from the psychiatrist's report. Well, I charged him, as I said, £6,000 sterling. I couldn't find the thing for pounds on my computer, so that's why. Now, here's the reality of it. The insurance stopped payment of £50,000 per year, and they hadn't paid him for 4 months, I think it was, and that works out to roughly £4,000. He was a very high-paid individual. So when I saw him, he was already £16,000 behind his disability. As far as the insurance company was concerned, they were never going to pay him another penny. So I came to see him, and this is what I did. I did 2 house calls from Canada to Bristol to see him and his physician, organized tests with his family physician. I was very happy to have met Dr. Myhill in Newcastle. She had already seen him, and she saw him again for me. I then had problems with the British health system in trying to obtain a proper technological assessment to this patient. So I brought him to Canada. I think he stayed at my house as well. And I did 2 visits to Montreal, which is there and back is half a day. And then, so I spent another 2 days in Montreal where we were testing him. I then brought him back to Ottawa, and I've seen him subsequently on 2 visits in England, and we've arranged several expert consultations in the United Kingdom for this patient. The amount of work this took represents probably almost a month's work on this patient alone. So if you put this in terms of $6,000 or £6,000, it starts to come into effect. And I saw him again a couple of days ago, and I will be continuing to see him for the next several years, as long as I'm still breathing, to protect him from the insurance company, and he's still being paid. So he has now brought in approximately £100,000 since I first saw him. So he's been recompensed for the terrible fee that I charged him. So he's had a net advantage from my visit from $90,000. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody calls me again. I really can't take the time of seriously studying these patients. Part of the problem we're dealing with here with insurance is the same problem we're dealing with in Canada. I never use the term chronic fatigue syndrome. I never use the term ME. As Dan has suggested, there's too much garbage associated with both of these terms. Not that one is good or one is better than the other, but the psychiatrists have got chronic fatigue syndrome and ME not only in their guns, they've got thousands of papers, it would appear to me, showing that these are psychological illnesses or different things. So what we do is we essentially examine the patient, and this is what we diagnosed this patient after the first physical examination. He had a hyperextensibility syndrome, meaning that he can take his thumb and touch his forearm. He can stand over and put his full palm on the ground without any difficulty. He was double jointed. And this is a genetic abnormality which in its extreme form can kill a patient with a very lax aorta. A lot of ME patients probably have a genetic variation of either Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, like he did, Berger's syndrome, Raynaud's syndrome, are probably very much minor aspects of autonomic nervous system. The linea alba, any girl, woman here who's got a hairline from the belly button down to the symphysis pubis probably had problems with polycystic ovaries or family history. These are marked signs of a genetic abnormality which most ME patients don't even know they've got. And so these are important things to know about. This young man had major temporal mandibular dysfunction. He had a positive Romberg. He had postural orthostatic tachycardia syndromes, plus a diabetes insipidus-like illness. Now, diabetes insipidus is not anything related to sugar diabetes. It's when you see this patient drinking and drinking all the time, urinating all the time. Now, there's a clue in this that if you don't have to get up at night, they say it's psychological. Well, this is not true at all as far as I'm concerned. So what we've done with this patient from an insurance point of view now is we've demonstrated multiple pathophysiological systems which is making this patient dysfunction. And I can tell you from having examined patients technologically now since 1984, and we are in a curious lacuna in Canada in so much as we can actually, as physicians, do any test that is available in Canada free of charge. And if it's not available in Ontario, we can send them to Quebec, and if it's not available in Quebec, we can send them to British Columbia, and we actually do this if that test is only available there. So we have been in a position which in the United Kingdom you don't have, in the United States they don't have, in many states, and there may not be the technology available. In others like California, there is masses of technology. So it's very hit and miss in the United States as well. So when we go to the insurance company, and this is one of the things that we did autonomic testing, and we were able to show he had severe hypertensive disease. His blood pressure, when we stood him up, dropped from to 80/40. His heart went up to 250 beats per minute just by standing this patient up. And we put him in a gravity suit, an anti-gravity suit, which they use in spaceships. And he said, "Can I keep it?" Because it was allowed him to maintain a pressure in his vascular system that he physiologically had lost. Now, this guy was a chemical toxicologist who had gone to Lake Baikal and had actually become exposed to toxins. He didn't have any of the Ehlers-Danlos symptoms before. He could do these things that I mentioned, but probably we're looking at a gene which is triggered by a virus or a toxin. And this is very important because many of the ME patients fall ill, and they may have live in the same house as somebody else, and they don't fall ill. They all come down with the same virus or the same infectious agent, whatever it is, and yet they don't. So this was very important. Now, I mention his case because of the some 500 insurance cases I've taken on in the United States and Canada, I've lost 2. I've won them all, except for those 2, by never using the word chronic fatigue syndrome, yet never using the term M.E., doing a complete physical examination, finding what is physically wrong with that patient, and then backing it up with technology. And often we have 7 years before we can get to court in these cases. Usually they break down the insurance companies beforehand, but every one I have actually won except 2. Only one of those patients, and there were roughly 500, who I also won, was a psychiatric patient. We did everything known to God and man. We didn't find anything wrong with her. And then I went back on her family history and found out that she had people who were murderers in her family, people who were rapists, people who were still in jail. It was a whole psychiatric, major depressive, every psychiatric disease possible this girl had in her family. And I presented this as a psychiatric case, and we got her disability. unfortunately, they gave her a lump sum, and she went out and bought a huge convertible and spent it all. But we're using then classical medicine backed up by highly technological tests to win her cases with the insurance, all of these cases with the insurance company. I'd like just to say a few things about our insurance industry in Canada. We have a provincial and federal insurance, and we have private. And I've just put Ontario and Quebec because they work out differently. The provincial insurance, if you're a male in Ontario, they will, and you're totally disabled and you've never worked, and this is true for children, they will give you maybe the equivalent of $500 a month, which is about 200 or 180 pounds a month. You can't rent an apartment even in the most rural part of the country at that. You certainly can't feed yourself. That is how bad our provincial disability insurance is. Federal is a bit better, but you have to sometimes go to a court type of situation. That you can only get if you've actually worked. And we get roughly $1,200 to $1,400 a month, which is still very poor. The private insurance in Ontario are associated very much with what you do. And in Ontario, the biggest single group of people who fall ill are teachers, usually primary school teachers who are involved in a lot of infectious disease contact, but all teachers. Teachers in chronic hospitals are even worse. The problem in Ontario with this group of insurance is that the Ontario Teachers Insurance Plan people have the same office donated by the insurance company. And they go out for lunch together, and they fight their own teachers right to the end so that the teachers don't get paid. Again, huge tragedies. In the province of Quebec, you have the opposite situation. They're very French, and they are very much associated with the rights of the worker. And they will fight for their teachers right down to the last breath. And there's no problem in the province of Quebec in getting insurance. I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. And I'll leave it if there's any questions. But essentially, if you want to win against an insurance company, it's better not to use names that they have an army of information against, such as M.E. or CFS. Go to the actual symptoms of the patient, the actual physical signs of the patient, support it by technological tests. Get a consultant that you know who's a psychiatrist to back up that this is a non-psychiatric illness, and you are in a good position to win, and we've won almost every case. So it's important not to use names, but to use real medicine, real technology to support your patient. Thanks. And if you are a teacher, one of the problems which I've never heard mentioned in M.E. or C is that it's almost impossible for a teacher to raise her arm. You may be able to stand as a teacher, but when you have to do this, even for a few minutes, and certainly an hour a day, you get so much pain in the upper spine that you can't function anymore. And so you see these teachers sleeping at the break, sleeping in their car at lunchtime, where it's 20 below zero, going to a shopping center where their students don't see them and sleeping, and then driving back, getting home and sleeping from the time they get home at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock at night until the next morning. And very rapidly they break down completely. They can't go on. So what is minor or major? if you try to push it, it's like the physicians who had no insurance. They may look fine until they have to work. And I think anybody with ME knows this. I don't know if there's such a thing as minor and major. I think it's all major, ME. It depends how much you push. Now, there are people, for instance, I saw a vice president of an insurance company who had ME. And she just sat in her office all day and napped. And she could do her job perfectly well. She didn't have to raise her arms. She got early retirement as well. And she never was subjected to having to mark papers at nighttime and do the things that a teacher has to do, or a healthcare worker or a physician. I don't know if there is such a thing as minor ME.
Actually, can I follow that up with one more question? Do you think it's possible to win an insurance case if you had insurance, but that the diagnosis was just, the initial diagnosis was wrong and delayed?
I do it all the time.
Okay.
All the time. All the initial diagnoses are wrong because they're supported by the insurance industry. They give the wrong diagnosis.
But if you actually don't actively have insurance because you've had to leave work because you're told it's due to stress at work, whatever, so you're out of the insurance blanket. And
that's a more difficult question, and it depends how long after. If it's a matter of within a year, and this is a real problem with ME patients, they get embarrassed. A lot of people are embarrassed about being ill. And so rather than being seen as a shirker or whatever, they say, well, I'm going to stop work for a month, and then I'll be better, and I'll be able to go back. And then a month goes by, and they're not better. And then 6 months goes by, and a year, and they've not been working. And then they're told that they aren't allowed to apply for insurance. This is a real social problem of individuals with ME. You have to be hard-headed and cold-blooded, and particularly the teachers and healthcare workers group of patients where you see so many of these ill people. I've won cases where they haven't worked for a year, but beyond that, it becomes a bit difficult.
Have you dealt with any people with ME who have had accidents? And
absolutely.
And how do you deal with things like trying to prove how their health deteriorated? And are they personal injury claims in Canada? Is it a similar setup?
I'm sort of laughing because I had a patient 3 years ago, she's still my patient, who was involved in heavy contact sports, inter-city contact sports, and university sports. In fact, I've got 2 patients like this. And both of them had multiple injuries to their head, their jaw, in one case, in both cases, I think, with jaw displacement, and upper thoracic and cervical injury. And this is where the sympathetic nervous system is triggered from, in part, as well as the brainstem, of course, but particularly this area. And the insurance company sent the one girl to a psychological institute to do progressive physical therapy on them and what have you. And they were called the Odyssey. And I wrote a letter to her insurance agent and copied it to the insurance agency. Said, the last time anyone went on an Odyssey voyage that I remember, the individuals were turned into pigs, drowned, or various other things, if you remember, Circe. They reported me to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And I had to plead my case to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and I never did send the letter to the actual patient. I just send the copy to them. And but what it did was it took them off the back of my patient for 3 years, during which time she was able to recover. I'll do anything to protect a patient.